All right, hello, Honors 110. So in today's class, we have an excerpt from Bossier's book, Palmer's Kiss, as well as two selections from the Reading the World text. So to dive right in here, starting with the Bossier, I wanted to turn to page 83 in the printed book. This is literally just the very first paragraph of the essay overall, Palmer's Kiss. So to read this, it says, "You'll go places," Mr. Howard said as I leaned against the wall, first in line to enter his 8th grade classroom. He'd said it before, always apropos of nothing, accompanied by an encouraging smile, sometimes a wink. I shrugged and looked away, pretending his praise embarrassed me. It did, a little, but privately I appreciated Mr. Howard's confidence in me, even as I had my doubts. What places? I wanted to ask him. Where? So for this paragraph, mostly I was wanting to kind of raise a more open-ended question. This kind of affirmation, this kind of encouragement, this approach from a teacher to a student. I'm curious, do we think that's actually helpful? What's the purpose of it? What's the point? Have you ever had this sort of experience? And if so, what did that kind of look like for you? I think it's just sort of one of those, less kind of directly kind of, disciplinary related, but nonetheless, kind of relatable, kind of more universal parts of a lot of people's kind of educational experience in one form or another. So again, what we kind of get out of those affirmations, do they have value? What is that value? General reactions there. Carrying on the very next paragraph, I'm going to jump toward the last couple sentences towards the end of that paragraph. But it reads, let's see. I couldn't be sure what he meant by this, but Mr. Howard often paired me with his most challenging students, such as the strange, troubled boy he assigned to the seat next to mine. This dynamic of a teacher kind of pairing a student who is more challenging, as Bossier writes it, more kind of problematic in class for a combination of reasons, with a more sort of high achieving student or one who, as is depicted here, has a more calming effect. I'm curious if we sort of recognize that, why we think that happens, and what sort of the outcomes of that sort of setup may be. Carrying forward here, let's see, page 84. This is the very next page. There's a section here towards the middle of the page. So it's the paragraph starting, "Wait, you don't actually believe this stuff." The lower part of that paragraph, it reads, "I liked learning how to decode the secret messages Mr. Howard said were hiding in every book. What meanings the author intended versus what meanings came later, once readers got their hands on it, interpreting and reinterpreting the words for sometimes hundreds of years. Today we read from a play, Romeo and Juliet." And this moment here, less of a question, but it's more just kind of a point of interest here. I think a lot of times we get kind of locked into this idea of whatever the author actually intended is sort of the right reading of a text. And sometimes I think that is true, and sometimes the way the author has articulated something is very specific and intended to render a very specific reaction from the reader. But I do think there's a lot to be said too for readers' kind of interpretations of things, especially when we're looking at older texts, where there might be something an author didn't necessarily explicitly intend for the reader to walk away with, but that nonetheless tells us something about the surrounding culture that author was operating in. So I think one of the ways in which we tend to see this is if authors are writing with what, in normal kind of contemporary standards would be considered something that's biased in some way, that's sort of implicitly sexist or racist or otherwise, kind of, biased against a certain group, that sort of demonstrates the social norms of the time versus any sort of, objective truth or what we would necessarily read that as today. That might not have been the author's intent, but nonetheless, it is kind of revealing about how that author thought or the context that they were writing in. Okay, carrying on here. I'm not going to actually read the excerpt here, but on page 86, there's this exercise where the teacher assigns Bossier to write a letter to her future self. And I'm curious if any of you have engaged in that kind of experience and what we think kind of the value of that sort of exercise is. And then on a related note to that, on 91, this is the very end of this selection, Palmer's Kiss. we have this part about kind of Bossier's reaction when she reads this letter later on. And I was curious kind of what sense we make of that in terms of her changed perspective just a few months later. If you had kind of experiences like this where you look back on something that you wrote earlier and notice some real changes in kind of how you see things or how you think about things, I think that could be kind of interesting to mull over. Okay, that's all I had identified from the Bossier, but as always, if you have other things you were interested in, please feel free to bring those into the discussion as well. But I'm going to switch books here to Reading the World. So for this one, we'll jump into the Feynman here, and I only have a couple spots that I want to take us to here specifically. The key one that I think is kind of most important in kind of getting at the central message that Feynman is writing about is this part on page 55, sort of towards the top of the page, where Feynman writes, after a lot of investigation, I finally figured out the students had memorized everything, but they didn't know what anything meant. And he goes on to elaborate with a specific example of that. And I'm interested in just kind of this principle of memorizing stuff without actually understanding it. We've touched a little bit on this concept earlier on in the class, but if this seems familiar to folks, why we think this happens, if this actually is kind of right or appropriate in some educational cases, why this might be problematic, so on and so forth. And then the other part that I want to get to from the Feynman essay is on page 56 towards the lower part of the page. This part just reads, one thing I could never get them to do was to ask questions. Finally, a student explained it to me. If I ask you a question during the lecture, afterwards everybody will be telling me, what are you wasting our time for in the class? We're trying to learn something, and you're stopping him by asking a question. This whole notion, I hope for most folks that at first blush, we kind of think this is just absurd, right? That if you have a question, you shouldn't ask it because everyone's trying to learn. I think probably we've all heard some version of this wisdom that if you have a question, it's probably the case someone else in the class has the same question. And I do hold that to be true in general in my classes. I do always encourage people to ask questions, when they have them for that purpose. Although I also do sort of recognize this social dynamic, for lack of a better way of saying it, that there are times, though, where there's that one annoying person in class who just always has a question, or it seems like they're asking questions just for the sake of getting FaceTime with the professor or just to hear themselves talk. So it can tip over to kind of a problematic place. But in any event, I wanted to kind of get your reads on that as well, if you've had those experiences and what you kind of think of that interaction. For our last reading, though, that we have assigned for today, we have the Nussbaum. So for this one, Nussbaum gets at some major ideas. One of the big ones is around how measuring the success of an educational system by economic growth, Nussbaum views is very problematic. And so I'm curious as to the class's thoughts on that. Do you agree with Nussbaum that this is not a good way of measuring economic growth, or at least there are better ones? If so, what would those other ones be, or what metrics should we be considering in terms of how successful an education system is? Otherwise, though, there's this point that she gets to, this is roughly pages 66 to 68, this notion about how the ruling class, or kind of the elites of a society, might not actually want very effective education for the masses, that there are certain reasons that might motivate them in the direction. I'm going to leave this really open-ended, just 'cause I think it's a super interesting point, and Nussbaum does give some examples of it, again, for page 66 to 68. But also, I think there are probably some practical examples we can think of in our own world. Just to plant this seed, I'll say I think this part actually speaks pretty directly to some other thoughts by scholars like Frederick Douglass, who I didn't have you read in this particular class, but he kind of brought up a lot of points around why in times of slavery that the slave owners didn't want their slaves to learn how to read, didn't want to educate them. I think there is some interaction, some overlap in terms of what Nussbaum is depicting about kind of today's elite or ruling class. So I'll leave that as again, a pretty open-ended question beyond that point. The last part I wanted to get to is on page 69 here, where we have this bullet point list at the very end of Nussbaum's essay, where she kind of goes through what she views as some things that she considers crucial kind of educational outcomes that students should walk away from their schooling with. And this really kind of boils down what I consider to be one of the main points of this essay, which is Nussbaum kind of frames education and one of its top priorities as being having an effective democracy. So setting people up to be able to participate in democracy by being well informed, by having good critical thinking skills, the ability to read critically, so on and so forth. And again, this list on 69 kind of breaks down point by point, kind of how what she sees as important in approaching that. So I'm curious, is this general notion, and feel free to specifically refer to that list. What do we make of that? Do we agree with this notion that these are kind of important elements of an education? If you kind of disagree or see limitations to this mindset, what are those limitations? Consider that any of that fair game for the discussion as well. Okay, but again, with both the Feynman and Nussbaum, similar to what I know I said explicitly for the Bossier, feel free to bring in other points, other questions of things I haven't addressed specifically in the video lecture. Certainly plenty of good rich food for thought across these three readings. But thank you as always for watching, and I look forward to our discussion.